The overall theme of what I'm, looking at is whenever you find yourself enacting this top-down systems change, and how can you really understand what's going to happen all that well, you might want to pause.
That's Paul Orlando, and this is the All Things Risk podcast. We're back. This is the All Things Risk podcast, and I am your host, Ben Catania. This show is all about long-form conversations using risk and uncertainty as lenses on the world. And today we talk about unintended consequences, which seems very appropriate because 2020 is the year for unintended consequences. My guest is Paul Orlando. Paul is a specialist in startups and helping startups succeed. He teaches business at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. And for the purposes of this conversation, he is an accomplished thinker and writer around systems and unintended consequences, or so-called second-order effects. He runs a blog with that name, and his insightful commentary has been featured in a range of publications. He's written over 80 articles on unintended consequences that offer some fascinating insights, and we talk about a few of them here, including why self-checkouts create an increase in shoplifting, how AI facial recognition technology can lead to false arrests, why we shouldn't have genetically modified mosquitoes. That's just to name a few. Paul's work on unintended consequences is an apt reminder that for better or worse, we as human beings do not know how everything works, and that uncertainty is an enduring aspect of our world. And that has some profound implications for the way in which we make decisions. Unintended consequences perhaps are all around us, and perhaps we ignore them or often don't consider and don't see them. And as we overcome this, and as we understand them better, and we appreciate complexity and systems more, we can, as Paul puts it, thrive. This is another fascinating conversation. So let's get right into it. Here is Paul Orlando on unintended consequences. Welcome to the All Things Risk podcast. Looking forward to this. This is going to be a lot of fun. The highlight of my day.
Thanks, Ben. Great to be here and talking with you.
Yeah, this is going to be a lot of fun. Unintended consequences, startups, and a range of things. So we'll see where it all goes. But before we get into that, I would love if you could just give a little bit of an overview, a bit of background as to who you are. You've done lots of interesting things. You've worked on startups. You've worked and lived in Hong Kong and visited China. Lots of things. So I wanted to just get a little bit of a understanding of your background and then how that led into your producing this blog called Unintended Consequences.
Sure, happy to. So my background covers a few different things, but there's also, some themes, over the years. So half of my career was a bit more large corporate structured, and then the more recent half is more startup structured. So I've always worked in technology one way or the other. And my focus now, I'd say maybe for the last 10 years or so, has been on first running my own startup, a telecom startup that I had in New York for a couple of years. And then afterwards reflecting on that experience and then really kind of trying to evaluate how small companies or early stage startups and founding teams figure things out or often don't figure things out. And then where I can helping people. So my focus after having my own startup, my focus became in running different startup accelerator programs. So that's where you work with a portfolio of companies at any given time. And it's really about trying to connect the dots between, one that you might be seeing today and one that you saw a year ago, make connections where appropriate, try to lend assistance or guidance where There might be some functional expertise or industry-related expertise, bring a lot of people together. And the interesting thing about startups and unintended consequences, of course, is while most of these companies just do not work out, some of them really work out and they grow very fast and they have national and international presence in a short number of years, and they become household names where in the very recent past nobody had heard of this thing. So anytime that you have rapid change, I'd say there is potential exposure to unintended consequences, or anytime that you have something growing very quickly as well, you have that exposure. So I suppose in my case, the way I became interested in this topic and ended up writing about it, and then now starting to speak about it a bit, was that I had seen a number of examples of companies that said, hey, we're focusing on this specific problem, and this is the solution, and therefore this is the improvement in the world. Very linear, very straightforward. When you dive in a little bit, you start to realize actually nothing is really that straightforward. So I just find the subject area to be fascinating. It's limitless in where you could go with the topic, and just following changes around the world. It's something that I found was helping me understand systems better, understand the world a little better. And so I've loved kind of diving into this topic over the last couple of years.
I can see the connection between what you've done with startups and unintended consequences. And before we dive into what you mean by unintended consequences and second order effects, I'm curious as to whether or not, so there's success stories in terms of startups, how much of that is luck? How much of that is skill? How can a startup founder let's say the odds of success are, 5%. So I suppose you can do a few things to get those to maybe 10%. But how much of that is actually startup founders just kind of diving into unintended consequences? And how much of that is down to some level of skill and craft?
My very rough estimate would be, well, first of all, I would say in general, like a startup founder probably doesn't concern themselves too much with unintended consequences. Mm-hmm. If they did, that could end up being contrary to what they're trying to do. If you start to consider, well, maybe I shouldn't do this too much, or this is going to have this other negative effect, let me choose not to act as quickly or do this a little differently, then you're going to be just outcompeted by someone else. You're going to move too slowly, right? So a lot of what startups would have to do, at least the ones that are scaling up, they're growing quickly, they're gaining a lot of investment, at least those, there's certainly an element of storytelling here. And you have a number, so think of just some of the common household names, Uber, Airbnb. These are companies which extend to the physical world as well, right? And they grew very quickly. There are certainly negative impacts of these companies. We could talk, a little bit about that. If they were to recognize that or, admit that up front, and therefore we are going to limit how fast we expand, or we're going to limit the number of passengers that we'll take in a city, or we're going to actually, proactively work with a regulatory body, they would move much more slowly. To some degree, I think a fast-moving startup is probably not baking in unintended consequences into the way they act. But I suppose that I got interested in this because I would see those those impacts, even if people didn't discuss them. And a lot of what I'll call storytelling of this, and I don't mean it in a negative way, but a lot of the storytelling of what are the benefits of specific companies that have emerged. Certainly, if you hear the company founders speak or the investors in those companies speak, again, they're not going to want to talk about, well, we did all these good things, and yes, of course, there were these negative outcomes. It's not really presented in that way. So I often find that when I will discuss, for example, with people, what are the risks associated with high-level autonomous vehicles? What are the risks associated with some other kind of areas where there's a lot of R&D? You often, if you dig into some of the data a little bit, you often have a very interesting outcome in that discussion, in that the other person really typically has not considered seriously what the other effects could be, and it's purely, well, this is all that I've only heard the positive.
Sure.
Like, why are you arguing for the other side? So so like systemic risk, a movement towards what is perhaps greater efficiency, but which actually starts to add risk into the equation in a systemic way. I find it to be fascinating, and it's certainly an area that that startups are impacting the world.
I want to get into some of that, and so, but before we do, could you just describe what you mean by unintended consequences?
Sure. So there's a number of ways to look at this, but the most basic sense, like you said, maybe we intuitively kind of understand what you mean. Like in the most basic sense, we took this action, we intended problem A to be improved, and there was some other impact. So it could mean that we tried to improve problem A, and actually we created problem B. A got better, but B got worse. It could be that we tried to improve problem A, and actually we made A worse. Or it could be that we tried to improve problem A, and then B got better. So like there was this unexpected benefit. So what I've basically mentioned are, you have the unexpected drawback. So that's where you try to improve A, and then B, something that you weren't considering, got worse. The perverse result, so that's you try to improve A, and actually you made it worse than it was before. Or the unexpected benefit, you try to improve A, and then B actually ends up improving. It wasn't your intention. So the world is complex. Even little snippets of the world are pretty complex, and it's often difficult when you are doing something that is kind of top down or fast moving. It's often difficult to really get a sense of all the different moving parts. When you do make either a change that is large or it is fast paced, it's top down, it's like a change made by fiat, or just because of the level of the speed of growth has that effect, you will often find these results that are unexpected and not what you intended. Sometimes it's not what you intended in a bad way, sometimes not what you intended in a good way. But this is the history of the world. And right. So you also mentioned second order effects. What are these? And there again, the second order effect or third order effect and beyond. This is very basically, you're saying, okay, I take action A, I expect this to improve this problem that I see. But what happens as a result of that? So it's like, what happens as a result of the change that you made, or the result of the change, and on. And that's where, there's a lot of, I'll say, good people with good intentions, and yet the outcomes of their actions sometimes end up being contrary to what they desire.
Right. And we can see all kinds of examples of that in the current world, whether it's Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica scandal and election interference and all of that kind of stuff. I wanted to just pull a little bit more on the startup thread, because I think there are a couple of things that you mentioned that are really interesting. I think when you're a startup, you're trying to solve for a specific problem, or I guess you need to define a market and a minimum viable product and kind of test things. And so when you're doing that, you're assuming that everything else in the world stays the same. And that's obviously not the case. You wrote a wonderful piece about autonomous vehicles where, okay, we can have that, we can reduce accident rates, but then, well, what if you have more of these vehicles on the road, traffic gets worse, all kinds of things, hacking, all kinds of things. And if you just kind of start with, I guess you have to start as a startup founder with a specific problem in mind. Otherwise, you can't move forward. But you're also making an assumption that everything else, or a vast majority of things, they're going to stay the same. But also I find that interesting because I think you, as a startup founder, you probably also have to be open to second order effects, because you're going to test something, but it may not work out the way it should. But those positive second order effects allow you to pivot and take advantage of a new market. And it's all about testing and then moving into the right direction. So in some ways, you have to be very adept at being open
Right.
to second order effects, but on the other hand, downplay the negative ones at the expense of the positive ones. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff there in the startup world. There's an agility that you need.
Absolutely agree. And I suppose I like some of the examples that I was choosing to look more into related to startups were, I agree, like you said, you do need to be quite open to changing direction. However, perhaps once you've decided on that direction, you've doubled down. And so like the examples that I've given, and it's maybe a little unfair to call them startups at this point because, Uber is not, I mean, they've been around for 10 years,
Sure.
Airbnb has been around 12 years. They've raised significant amounts of capital. They have, international presence. So these companies aren't not really startups anymore, but there are certainly effects that just are a result of their bigness or the speed at which they moved. I don't know. I'll give you an example. Maybe it's it kind of talks through a more concrete example. So on the part of, say, like an Uber or a Lyft, the tactic for entering a new geography, for these companies, like it certainly made sense, for them, and it's something that a more established company or like a corporate couldn't necessarily do. But the tactic years ago was, well, we don't exactly have permission to enter this new market. We don't have a taxi license, but but maybe that doesn't matter. We're not really a taxi. It's we're this other thing. So let's just go in. We'll get the public opinion behind us because, to be honest, in a lot of markets, the experience that passengers had with taking a taxi wasn't great. Right? The cars weren't new, they weren't clean, it was expensive, it was hard to find one. So the experience wasn't great. And now you come in with something that I'd say, well, it is a better experience, right? It's in general cheaper, they are more available. I just have to tap a button on my phone. I don't have to stand on the street, holding my arm out. I don't have to call a phone number if I'm trying to order a cab and I don't know when they're going to show up. So the experience is better. And like the tactic of, well, you just go in and then you beg for forgiveness later on, or you have a little negotiating power with the municipality. Do you really want mayor of the city? Do you really want to have thousands of angry citizens who really want our rideshare service? And you're trying to kick us out. So the tactic makes sense. But some of the people left behind by that, in the Uber case or the Lyft case, are the owners of taxi medallions who, they followed all the rules. It wasn't a fault of their own, but they sunk a significant amount of savings, and even, this was an investment vehicle for them, a retirement strategy for them, by a taxi medallion that allows them to drive a car, which basically is priced like an annuity. So it allows them the right to generate income by driving around the city. And you can always sell that asset afterwards. And in general, it's an asset that held up well. So now you have this new entrant, which becomes larger, very quickly, larger than the number of taxis. And I was kind of drawing on New York City, where I had lived for a number of years. And there's a lot of data published about this. But so now you have this impact where, yes, passengers got a lot of benefit. You didn't, however, take care of this group of taxi drivers and medallion owners. What happens when you have thousands of people who cannot pay off the taxi medallion, or for whom they are in extreme cases there were a number of suicides from medallion owners. This was their one big investment. They can't pay it off. What's the what could they possibly do at this point? So to the typical passenger, maybe you say, well, I don't care. But then on the part of the government, maybe you say, well, the role of a government in that situation is to try to balance out those two sides. And how that is done, I think, is a little uncertain. But maybe you don't want to have the quote unquote people who did the right thing, taxi drivers. Maybe you don't want them to be so rapidly punished. Maybe you want to ease that in some way, and how that will be done is yet to be seen. But there's an example for which you see, like, well, in general, most people had a benefit. A small number of people had a really bad outcome. So do you decide to balance those somehow? And that's kind of like the trade-off. And you could say, well, this is just the way innovation goes, right? I agree. But yeah, if you're thinking of, you're trying to like balance this out just for the benefit of society, do you choose to extract some type of a fee from an Uber or Lyft to pay back to the medallion or taxi drivers? Do you choose to do something that allows them to expand but slightly more slowly? Difficult questions, right? Same thing with a Airbnb example. So where you have around the world, these beautiful little towns or resort towns, towns that might be in high demand for a certain season of the year, and you want to expand the number of people who can go and stay there, and visit, live there for a short time. Great option, right? All of a sudden, I go from having a small number of hotel rooms to, well, it could be a much larger number, immediately. And, there again, if you are a visitor, it's a good outcome for you. Now, all of a sudden, I can afford to stay in a really cool neighborhood. There were no hotel rooms available during this busy season. Now I can stay in someone's house that's an Airbnb. And again, like, great outcome for the visitors. If you are, however, living there, that's your home. Fact is, rents actually go up on average. So that's been something that's been demonstrated. And then in cases where it's a small location, and so I think in my article I was pointing out, like, Reykjavik in Iceland, some other like small resort towns. If that's your home and you're living there 12 months of the year, all of a sudden you're priced out. Or you might even find if you're between housing, there isn't availability, because why do I want to give you a 12-month lease when I could make more than I would make in that year by just renting it out for those 2 months of the busy season? So again, I don't think it's something that the founding team of Airbnb really thought about or worried about, because when you're starting this company, a lot of the benefits were there, right? They started 2008 during, we were just talking about the election cycle, but they started 2008 during the Democratic and Republican national conventions, when every hotel room was booked up. And now all of a sudden I have the ability to put a little more inventory on the market, and people can benefit from that. If you carry that forward and place it in a lot of different parts of the world, you see like extreme visitors to places like Venice, right? Because all of a sudden you bring more inventory on the market. You find like these tiny resort towns where someone who actually that's their home, but they're not a landowner or like a house owner. Yeah, they're priced out, or there is just no available. And
where does the fault lie for those unintended consequences as well? Like in economics, right, you have the concept of externalities. So there's it's a negative externality, and it's a cost that can't necessarily be borne by the founder. A regulator, a government needs to step in. But if you look at the pace of technological change, I mean, public institutions are just not keeping pace. You just have to look at parliamentary inquiries and hear on things like the election interference, or in the US. And these legislators do not understand the technology, let alone, the laws and all of the institutions and all the regulators. So it becomes, it's an interesting societal problem that we're dealing with in many ways right now.
Absolutely. And I'm not claiming certainly that, let's just slow everything down, or let's have a regulation-led innovation stream. That also doesn't make any sense. And like you said, you potentially just have poorly educated on this topic, poorly educated, government, legislators, trying to make a decision. And again, it's like a top-down decision that's going to have some other unintended consequence. So, some of these problems, I'm not really saying that they are completely solvable. the first thing I try to do is just point out
Right.
some of those consequences. Yeah, and let's actually consider, well, I see, maybe it's not all a positive outcome, this business that was growing really quickly, or this new policy that we thought was, going to do a lot of good. There's a lot, but certainly, thinking about, well, there's a difference between having a good heart or a good intent. There's a lot of people with good intentions, and yet the outcome of their actions or the decisions are really contrary to what they ever would have wanted.
Mm-hmm. That's, I think, just the nature of being a human being, which is interesting because now we can talk about AI a little bit. And I know you wrote an interesting piece on facial recognition and AI, and that's interesting for a number of perspectives. I actually just said at the outset that I don't want to make this too topical, but there've been protests in the US. We have coronavirus, people are wearing masks. It'd be interesting to just summarize for my listeners who may not have read that article about facial recognition and unintended consequences as a result of that.
Right. So some of what I was writing about regarding facial recognition tech was that there are certain inevitable outcomes, I'll say, that are just purely driven by some technological improvements that have a level of predictability to them, or business models that emerge which support a certain outcome. So in the case of facial recognition technology, this is something it's been out there for a while. It's been improving over time. And at first I was thinking of this as, well, this is maybe a policy driven improvement. So police departments, governments are, different parts of the world, increasing numbers of, parts of the world, they're using facial recognition technology just as a policing tool. Mm-hmm. So get a identification of a suspect, which would have taken months of research, and now you can do that very quickly. And there's quite a few companies that provide this technology, both American companies and international companies. And so there are certainly a number of just technological trends that support that: faster processors, cheaper and more plentiful cameras and sensors that you can place around a city. Also, just even in a place like the US, where the US is historically, or Americans, I think, are historically skeptical or cautious about a national identification card, right? Mm-hmm. This has come up a number of times. So there is no such thing, in the US, although you have a driver's license, or you have a passport, or you have other forms of ID that has your photo. But being able to cross-check someone's image when they're walking down the street with something that appears on social media, and then triangulating to the identity of an individual, right? That is happening now. That's possible, today. So for me, this question, it's partly the capabilities there, right? Whereas if we were talking, years ago about this would be sci-fi, but the capabilities there. Enough of the population is in the presence of a camera on a given day, and enough of the population already has many different versions of their face from different angles online. So if the technology is there, and if it is, say, relatively cheap, does it just become inevitable that this happens? And even if you say, okay, we're going to make prohibitions on its use, do you just get it in other ways? So a few municipalities have prohibited some degree of this, like San Francisco, I believe, is one of the earlier ones, prohibit the use in the city, or some factors of its use. But there's something inevitable about this, in that when you have just the improved computing power, sensors or cameras that are just placed in many parts of an urban area, and then the ability to cross-check images, it seems like it's going to happen. So what can you do? You either legislate that you cannot admit evidence from that type of a collection, or maybe in some cases you also say, well, while individuals might put these cameras or other sensors up, we're not going to allow a police department or some other government agency to officially collect this. It seems like it's a very slippery slope, because certainly at this point an individual can run their own facial recognition service say people walking by their home. It's possible to do that now.
And so the number of risks there. One of them is that if there's an error and the wrong person gets, let's say there's a crime, and then the wrong person gets arrested because of some error in the software and the algorithm, and that becomes really interesting because on the one hand, you'd probably have people saying if there's egregious crime or whatever, got all this information, and the law is all, sort of, whether it's balance of probabilities or whatever. So the wrong person gets arrested and prosecuted. But at the same time, what you're talking about, do we preserve individual rights? And then who designs these algorithms? Which ones are permissible? Which ones aren't? It becomes super complex very quickly.
It does, absolutely. And the high-profile example of this going awry was from a couple months ago. It was a false arrest that happened in early 2020. Someone who was arrested based on a very grainy video of somebody stealing watches in 2018. So and this was his name was Williams, was the supposed criminal who was arrested falsely. This as well, when you dove into the story and when I actually read the details about it, it was a little different than what I saw was presented headlines or in the high level news reports, which was here's the first example of facial recognition going awry, and this is going to be an outcome. When I dove into it, actually, it was much more about just, I'd say, bad policing. Mm-hmm. So you still need human beings to make these, to admit or to trust the outcome of this facial recognition AI. So when you look at, the grainy video, and then when you also compare it to this person, and then also some of the other, he had an alibi for where he was that day. A lot of those things kind of just were set aside. And so I attribute this individual case more to just bad policing than facial recognition gone awry. Mm-hmm. But when you think, well, scale this up, now have this be the norm, and you have police departments that are, more cash strapped, or, there's less staff on hand. What do? Do you just default to what the algorithm tells you, is the person of interest, and you go there first? That could happen. And it would be a shame if facial recognition tech actually led to less accurate, arrests, in the future. So it's something where, again, I just kind of go back to the theme of where you have rapid change. There's something that's unintended that's going to happen because you haven't had the time to think through some of the outcomes, or you haven't had the time to recognize some of the, the bad outcomes. And, this was a little unusual example, but, one example, from the U.S.
You also mentioned you've written about shoplifting and self-checkout. So it might be useful to another example of that self-checkouts increase shoplifting. Right.
And that was a study done. So if you're luckily unfamiliar with automated checkouts, this is where, it's a little funny to argue against them, right? Because the job of being a cashier, it's not really the job that you might say, I want more people to be cashiers. It's not, that's not really the argument. Although I'd say a real cashier does a lot more than just process a transaction. They answer questions, they help customers, they do a lot of different things. But as a cost-saving measure, a number of stores, typically larger stores or chains, would implement these self-checkout systems. And so, it's a cost savings. I don't have to pay a cashier by the hour. I have this fixed cost of installing, these units, these scanner units. And, I push that cost and time to the shopper. Mm. And so it's a win for the store. It's not a win for the shoppers, though, right? In general, people don't like these self-checkout systems because, well, now they have to do the work. Mm-hmm. And in general, those systems don't really work all that well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's always a clerk that helps you out whenever the wait.
There's always the wait's there's some kind of error, and now you need to wait for somebody to come over. So like there was a study done of what is the impact of installing them in terms of, do you increase the likelihood that somebody's just going to say, you're asking me to do this, I'm going to like just walk out with, this product, or I'm going to scan the wrong thing and put something else in my shopping cart and and walk out. So there was a study of that where they were looking at, I believe, over $20 million in transactions, and finding that close to $1 million of the transactions were shoplifted in locations where there's automated checkouts. But it was reminding me of something that Charlie Munger said. Charlie Munger from Warren Buffett, Munger, Berkshire Hathaway. He said decades ago about, I think he actually said it's a sin for like a manager to create a system that's so bad that it actually encourages or like enables someone to steal from the company. You put somebody in this situation that they really should not be in, and then there's this little temptation, and then one day they had a hard day, whatever, they lost something somewhere else, and now they say for the first time, okay, I'm going to take that product. So it's almost like, if you create a bad system, so I'll say that the general self-checkout is bad because it doesn't really work the way it's supposed to work. So you create that bad system, and then you have somebody who maybe never before would have stolen something from a store. They just say, forget this. I'm taking it. Or it's a machine. What difference does it make? The machine doesn't care. And that's kind of a shame. So that's where, I don't think those first-time shoplifters were necessarily like bad people or on the path. They would have done that anyway. But they put in this situation which brings out a different type of behavior than we might have seen otherwise. And you have like different degrees of this all around as we replace humans with some type of automation, or you have a different result. Years ago, so I had that startup in New York. And this is something that I actually have not written about. I was doing a communication service, which the actual use case was, it was a way for patients with serious health conditions to speak to another patient. It was voice only, no video. Speak to another patient, and protecting the privacy of either side, speak to them and just get that like moral support. And then after they talked, we would pass information out to either side from their doctor or from their support group. Some survey information, some additional data on how they could continue to be healthy, that type of thing. Before we got to that point, we had a number of iterations. And at first, it was just chat. So it was just like text. At one point, it also included video. And what we actually found was when it was text only, in other words, you've removed as many of the, say, human elements as possible. You're still communicating, but you're not facing somebody, you're not hearing a voice of an actual human. When it was text, that's when the conversations became rude, became like really not helpful, negative at times. When we took away text and made it voice only, the amazing change was people behaved really as though they were right there talking to another person sitting next to them. If you met a stranger, sitting next to you in a cafe, something that we don't do that much anymore, but if you did that in the past, you're not probably, you're not going to start out by being rude or by being abusive. You're going to have kind of a polite, a normal exchange, and maybe you get into an actual conversation. Just seeing, they're the same people, right? It's just that the medium like pulls out a different kind of behavior. And if it's, text only, I interact in a different way. But if I bring the voice in, all of a sudden, like I never would have said such a thing out loud. That would have been, that's very rude. Like, I'm gonna try to understand the other person first and have a dialogue. So there again, like it's a change in the system, and we found that it led to a dramatic improvement with the results that we were getting. Same people though. It's just different outcomes.
That's interesting, and similar to the way you describe, say, a cashier who does a lot more than simply ring up your groceries. There's a whole contextual piece that perhaps when we're designing something and trying to zero in on the core of a problem, we ignore that context. So when we're speaking to someone There's very much perhaps a self-perception of how I sound. If I'm speaking, I want to be polite. There's some human behaviors that are kind of ingrained. Whereas if I'm just chatting in a text, well, it kind of becomes like a video game, and I'm just operating within the confines of that. And so if it's similar to, let's say, a shoot 'em up game, I'm just going to shoot everything in sight. It's similar. Something may happen in our brains that creates that. But these unintended consequences are all around us. I'm thinking about COVID-19 and home working, and the fact that I think there was a study that came out recently that said the average working day for people that work from home has increased by 45 minutes or something, because we don't have the commute. We don't have that sort of downtime where you switch off before work or after work, and that creates these longer days. People feel tired as a result. And it's another example of technology creating second order effects, unintended consequences. Maybe in COVID-19 case of home working, not so significant, but if you're in that space, you do feel it.
The interesting outcomes from COVID have been, it was a very quick change that impacted the world, very
suddenly.
as well. It's very suddenly. So, and different countries in different ways, or to different levels of how extreme it was. And we're really still somewhere in the middle of this. Who knows when at what point we are in the middle of this, but it's still probably pretty early. Still really feeling what the impacts will be, long term, or where will it get worse? Where will it get better? But the interesting thing that I've seen, at least in, say, some of the startups that I've worked with, some of them, ironically, were just well positioned for a remote first world. It wasn't their intention, but they happen to be now benefiting from that. Some of the ones that I have, which are focused, say, on health tech, and especially where you can deliver things digitally. Even some of the others where it's a low tech business, but it's food and beverage, it's apparel, and people are not going out as much to eat, so they're cooking at home, or they're ordering, products to be delivered so that they can cook with, or it's an e-commerce apparel company, and there's a benefit. People are not going out in person as much to shop. So like the winners and losers of a remote first world, you sometimes get winners where it was all timing. It was just where they happened to be, and this big change happened, and it hit them in a different way than it hit some other incumbent. So COVID has been, I wrote quite a bit about it, in different ways, both, tracking it early this year before it really was, say, impacting the US. So really starting to look at it, first in China, and then in Italy, and then, more recently in the US. And I ended up setting the subject aside, at least for the last few months, because, it both started to permeate everything. And I also, to be honest, some of it was a little depressing. I needed to, kind of move on to another topic. One of the comparisons that I drew, I think in the first article that I wrote about it, was in looking at early versions of, or early plagues. And I had written about plague or disease, a number of times, even a couple of years ago. So one of the, again, unintended, outcomes, if you look back to, say, bubonic plague and its spread around Europe, where there are pretty good records, the pace of its spreading, say, city to city or mile by mile, whatever, it's measured not in days or hours, it's measured in weeks or in months. And you can actually see, that city was hit, it was a port. And then, it's walking distance to this other place, or it's on a river, and people who were, traveling back and forth, carried it, in this certain area. So you see, the trade routes were the ones that carried it, primarily, because that's how people were moving. And if you think back to the recent past, say, comparing SARS to COVID, so SARS being, say, 2003, 2004 time period, there was a significantly smaller number of travelers, international travelers, say specific China to the US, just that one. I think the increase, it was something like a 20x increase, 15 or 17 years time. So in terms of being able to spread something quickly, even before you're really aware that there is something that's spreading, that's a game that's already lost. You're thinking of it in like a tactical sense, like, can you stop the flow of movement around the world? We live in a world where there's a lot of benefits from being able to travel quickly and comfortably, around the world. Right? That's a route that I certainly did many times, US to different parts of China, and you could do that under a day. That's a trip that you could do, which was not the case in the relatively recent past. And that means while you do have those benefits, if you do have something that is a communicable disease, it can spread much more quickly. And that's something that you have to be able to, to live with if you're going to still be traveling, at the rates that, that we have been. It'll be interesting to see longer term effects of COVID on travel. So say after a vaccine, does it still impact the way people travel, or is there just like latent fear? Or maybe does some of the business related travel stay suppressed, but leisure travel, maybe comes back up? I don't know. Mm-hmm. But yeah, just comparing the rate at which you can go from what is this thing to like, wow, it's already, has presence in, many parts of the world. If you could have a world, obviously this is not really desirable or possible, but if you had a world, say, where people moved at the same pace that they did centuries ago, but you had the speed of, but like information could flow, rapidly, maybe then you could more intelligently, like, stop a human movement where it was needed, in a case of a emerging pandemic. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's
super interesting. I was thinking about, as you were talking, so polio has effectively been eradicated in Africa as of, I think today was there's an announcement about that. Now that's positive news, but at the same time, polio has been around forever, and there's been a vaccine, and so, wow, right? So with COVID, are we going to have these situations where we'll have pockets of the world where there is no vaccine that's been distributed, or and by the way, that could happen in your country as well, or my country too, where people refuse to possibly take vaccines. Yep. So you might have these these pockets of, this is a COVID infested area, and that might go on for decades, right? Decades. And what are the consequences of that? How are we going to have to deal with something like that? And we're talking about second, third, fourth order effects in a variety of ways. So there's so much that we don't understand, and this is just one disease. There could be other communicable diseases that come out. So it's we're entering into unknown territory. So I don't know if you have any thoughts. I'm curious about what you think about that, or the precautionary principle around, if something is irreversible and significant, well, should we just leave it alone? And what can we leave alone? And if you have any thoughts on any of that, I mean, you probably have lots, but anything that comes to mind. Those are complex questions. So like you said, you certainly could see some outcome being that pockets spread around the world that for whatever reason, whether it's individuals choose, or these are places where it's just difficult to get distribution, like of something like a vaccine. You can see maybe there are pockets where COVID or some other disease is just latent, there in the population. It's an endemic and it just stays. And I suppose like those perhaps are the same places that don't get a lot of visitors from outside. So maybe actually it's kind of, and maybe is people care less maybe, in other parts of the world about that, possibly. Or you have a situation where certainly when I would travel to various countries, I would take medicine for malaria, right? Or, like other illnesses. And maybe something similar there where a traveler can inoculate themselves, whether it's with a vaccine or whether it's something that, lasts for a short time, and it's good enough for travel into a new place, even though this disease is continuing to impact the people who are resident there for years. So, like disease, just in general, or as a study of disease, it's
fascinating because you see different approaches around the world, and you just see like, different diseases. The reason that we even talk about, like, say, malaria, today, you were mentioning like, polio, where there was a pretty effective vaccine that was available for like decades and decades, right? But still, like, to reach all pockets of the world, like, it took generations. On the other side, you have malaria, where there is a vaccine, but it was never really, it had like a very low level of efficacy, and it, required like, multiple, rounds of the medication. And as a result, it's not really the go-to, solution. And, instead it's bed nets. It's like, trying to remove the environments for mosquitoes to live, or keeping people out of certain, like heavily infested areas. But yeah, like, I always just reflect on like the previous discussion that's been had for years, actually, about mosquito eradication related to malaria. There isn't a similar thing for, the coronavirus, right? Or certainly for polio. But the mosquito eradication, issue is interesting because, the mosquitoes are the vector for the transmission of the Plasmodium, microbe. And so it's a little different case. And so you say like, well, I don't have a good vaccine. Let me instead wipe out this insect that is the main spread of a disease. And even today, like, there's hundreds of thousands of people who die around the world, and mostly in Africa, actually, from malaria. Used to be a big problem in more parts of the world, like including the U.S., and it was eventually like, extirpated, in many parts of the world. But some of the, I guess, the skepticism that I have for like a genetic
you've written about this. Yeah, you've
right. And when this is like something like mosquito eradication, or like, we haven't really spoken about like, AVs yet, but when you take something that, malaria has been for generations, something that kills many people around the world. So are you really going to argue against it? Right? Like, nobody wants to argue, for malaria, right? But then when it comes to, okay, well, the solution is wipe out mosquitoes, or genetically modify mosquitoes as a way of, eliminating malaria. It's this, again, it's a potential systemic risk. Who owns that risk? Right. As in, if it goes wrong, who goes to jail?
Right. Is it a country, a government, whoever, whatever entities develop that technology that does this? And then we're talking about second, third. I mean, we're only now understanding the important role that bees play in our ecosystems. Well, I'm sure specialists in bees, right, understand. But if you talk to the average person at a I don't know, dinner party or something about the importance of saving the bees, right? That people get it now, but 20 years ago, bees, or what the hell? They sting and they blah blah.
Right. Exactly. Right? That's what my kids say. Right? They don't like bees because they've been stung by bees. Like, they're mean, right? So why would you want to save them? Right? And yeah, like I saw online, I don't know, a number of weeks ago, somebody, wrote something like, what purpose does the mosquito serve? And that's like, that is the problem. It's like, it's not like it is a purpose that this.
That's a very human utilitarian way of looking at the world. Right. Everything sort of serves a certain purpose. You don't know that if the bee or the mosquito is a food supply to, I don't know, whatever lizards or whatever else, and the system of food and ecosystems is obviously so complex that we just unintended consequences. Oh my God, right?
Right.
So I'm with you. I'm kind of the view, don't touch it, right? Completely eradicating mosquitoes. We just don't understand what the ramifications of all of that might be.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Especially as you've seen, like, some of the experiments with doing that, in local areas, turn out to be not the way they intended. So, like, there was an introduction of genetically modified mosquitoes in Brazil a couple of years ago, and then they published the follow-up results, and then they realized, so the typical way this happens is they introduce sterilized males into the population. So they release like tens of millions of sterilized males. So you have like, the females mate with these sterilized males, and so you don't get, fertilized eggs from them. And then they discovered that actually there was a genetic transmission between the two. So, in other words, either it wasn't 100% of the males that were sterilized, or they were accidentally releasing females along with the males. And so again, like time will tell whether there is really an unintended outcome of something like that, like producing a stronger mosquito or a more infectious mosquito. But this is where I just want to pause wherever there is something that's too top down in a system where the thought is, well, these bugs don't serve any purpose. It's who likes to get bitten by mosquitoes, apart from the malarial risk. Mm-hmm. And that's where I just tend to say, okay, you're introducing some type of systems risk. We don't really understand it well yet. Some of the speculation around what happens where you say if you were to remove mosquitoes and you have, again, people who then move into parts of an environment where formerly they might have stayed out because there were too many mosquitoes, or they wouldn't have spent a long time in there. This is the one of the arguments of what an unintended consequence could be, is that people move into new environments. They are hunting more forest animals, right? That is a way that Ebola was actually transmitted originally, decades ago. So you save people on malaria, maybe, if all goes well, but then you have this other, outcome where they're exposed to, quote unquote, bush meat and other diseases. The overall theme of what I'm, looking at is whenever you find yourself enacting this top-down systems change, and how can you really understand what's going to happen all that well? You might want to pause a little bit first, and just consider
It's something that Nassim Taleb has written about in the Black Swan, and it's the basis of the precautionary principle and things like this. And I actually wanted to bring it back a little bit to, before we start to wrap up, startups as well. In that, so in the startup worlds, as you mentioned, storytelling is very big, and that book, The Hero's Journey, is also very popular amongst startup founders. And you've got this sort of very kind of simple story and narrative, and it's powerful because when you're describing your business and what it does, we're hardwired to remember stories. So stories are often used, but then a lot gets neglected when we're just talking in the world of stories about second order effects. And it might be possible you didn't sort of plan this out through this sort of classic hero's journey. You just kind of stumbled from one thing to another, and actually you just kind of stumbled across several second order effects and created a business, but then you wrote it up as a story. And I do worry sometimes about decision making, that we may not take all those kind of contextual factors into account when we're making decisions. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, and ways in which we could. Well, actually, what I'm just getting at is any thoughts on how individuals and organizations can better think about unintended consequences in decision making.
I think some of the incentives for an organization to do that are, they're just not there. Like the incentive is actually to not think about certain things, because that prevents the project from getting funded.
Right.
That slows everything down. That lets you, be outcompeted by a competitor. So there's actually a lot of just whether it is intuitive or whether it's thought out, there's a lot of reasons to not think about these things. And if something goes wrong, what is the worst that happens? You don't get the bonus at the end of the year.
Right. It's society. Society's left holding the bag, and the regulators and everything else. It's exactly like the financial crisis, where these financial weapons of mass destruction were created, and the gains were privatized, but the losses were socialized.
Exactly. And related to startups, maybe just the last point. So a discussion that I've been having for a while with people is related to autonomous vehicles, and the storytelling is that why on earth would you choose to maintain this high level of fatalities caused by automobile accidents, right? Humans aren't perfect. They make mistakes. They drive drunk. They drive tired. In the U.S., which is a pretty safe country related to automotive accidents, it's about 3,000 fatalities a month. It's a lot higher in other parts of the world, actually, unfortunately. And so why on earth would you want to argue for that continuance? And instead, turn over driving to a computer that's going to do this much better, that's not going to be tired, not going to make mistakes, going to learn as it goes along. And that is the story that has led to hundreds of millions of dollars of investment in various companies related to autonomous driving. And the reason that I pause here, and this kind of relates to the whole startup, or who eats the risk of something like this, is I think of it as when you have human drivers, yeah, they're not perfect, but human beings are kind of comfortable with that type of a risk, as in I kind of understand, when I get in the car, in general, it's pretty safe, but yeah, there is this tiny risk. I need to remember to be vigilant, or I just need to build that into the way that I go about my day. And maybe if the autonomous cars work as well as they potentially do, maybe you reduce those fatalities monthly to from 3,000 to maybe it's 30. It's like significant. Once in a while, though, do you get that 30 to then spike up because there's a bug that propagates an entire fleet? Right. Or there is a group that hacks into again a fleet or geography and causes just mayhem. So I wonder, since you cannot actually convince human beings to be less safe as drivers, that's something that's just, it's contrary to their personal interest because it puts them at physical risk. You can't convince people to drive and kill themselves. You can do that top down with an AV system. At least in theory, and we have many examples of different systems being hacked or bugs propagating. So that's one again where I pause a little bit and I say, okay, if this is mainstream and it's level 4, level 5 levels of autonomy in driving, do you make things safer for a little while? It's an efficiency or an optimization question, but also every once in a while you have this huge spike and it's chaos and an entire city is shut down, right? And that's one of the things that led to me being just a little bearish about autonomous driving, and maybe we should rethink how we would deploy this in an environment, and there's been a number of ideas about that, but that's again it's a question where I don't really see a lot of people taking the other side and saying, okay, well, we have this efficiency that comes in, but what happens if it breaks down? And the way things operate today, it's human drivers individually driving. I cannot make a million of them do the wrong thing today if I want. They all have that self-interest, and they're all individuals. So, but I could do that with a fleet of autonomous vehicles, or either intentionally or unintentionally. So, there again, that's a startup story that has been told a number of times. It's about safety, who likes the drudgery of driving, right? And again, it's something that just makes me wonder about the risks.
Then there are all kinds of potential unintended consequences. I guess, are you thinking about things like phasing the deployment or having different models of seeing AVs with human-driven vehicles and things like this? Or
so some of the concepts were also around having a special a lane that is only so no humans enter that driving area. So even if there is a disruption of some sort, you're taking human beings out of that. Because as well, human beings like to play with different situations, and you'll certainly see, you see it even now when you can recognize the test vehicles driving around, people will play with them in ways that they would not if it were a regular car. So that's going to be another big area.
Right. Having a bit of backup or redundancy to going back to the old system is not necessarily a bad thing, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I was thinking a little bit about. So I'm a cyclist, and I think a lot about traffic, and I think about right now in London we're experiencing, actually around the world, a bit of a cycling boom with COVID, but the infrastructure here, even in spite of a number of investments, is still very car centric, and traffic, like in any big city, is really bad. And I and many others would prefer not to have as many cars, but you go back to how it got this way, and going back post World War, manufacturing, everyone wanted to have a car. You see this happening in emerging market economies where traffic is terrible, but because incomes are rising and people, they want their cars. The infrastructure isn't built for it, so you get these massive traffic jams, and we in the West are starting to reverse that in many countries. But that's another example of unintended consequences, is how motorized vehicle focused we've become.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, for efficiency as well. Like there's a number of parts of New York where traffic is bad, so let's put extra lanes in, right, or let's create a highway. And what happens? Well,
more people drive. Right.
More people drive. Right.
Right. So
that wasn't what we wanted. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I wanted to start to wrap up because we've gone for a little bit, but I feel like I can talk to you about this for probably another few hours, right? But want to be respectful of your time. But before we do, I was just wondering if there was anything else that you could taken away in your work around decision making to think about second order consequences, and anything that you've done, or that whether it's in your own life or whether it's in the work that you do, to try and better account for some of these things.
For anybody listening who wants to just get a framework of that, I recommend reading Robert Merton's paper, which is an old paper, but it's about he's often attributed to like originator of this term, right, unintended consequences, but causes of unintended consequences, according to him, being like basic values, error, ignorance, short-term versus long-term interests, and what's called the self-defeating prophecy. So I've written about each of those a couple of times. So if you really wanted to start to dig in, you might just read up a bit. I have been just personally, in terms of decision making, been personally trying to educate myself and kind of using different events that pop up around the world as an ability to try to train myself into thinking about, well, what do I think is going to happen? Let me write that down. Let me see how good my prediction was. Let me try to consider what some of the other consequences could be. How important are they? So I've found it's made me often the person with the contrary opinion in some of these discussions I have with friends. But it's something I feel like it's made me a little better educated about looking at events around the world. So I don't have any easy suggestion for people other than start reading a bit and thinking, okay, if you hear about this new business or this new policy or this new change, what do you think the result of the result is going to be?
Right.
That's
a great starting point. Very simple but powerful. The result of the result.
Right.
Good stuff. Is there anything that you think you wanted to mention that we didn't get a chance to before we wrap up?
This is a really big topic. Like you said, we could keep talking about this for quite a bit. I often feel like I express myself a little better in writing than in speaking. So, and I'm trying to actually change that a bit. But so nothing comes to mind other than if you want to check out some of the things that I've written, that's probably where you see a little more detail.
And where's the best place for people to follow and find you?
So if you Google Unintended Consequences blog, you should find me. It's just the word, the two words, unintended consequences, with the dot before the ES. Okay. So I chose two very long and hard to write words, and also a very strange, domain name. But that's how you can find me. And I appreciate always hearing from people and hearing about other topics that I might consider writing about or looking into. Because like I said, this has been something that's helped educate me about risk, and it's also gotten me just talking with a lot of different people around the world. So I've appreciated being involved.
I'll put all of that in the show notes. Paul, this is fantastic. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Bye for now.
All right, I hope you found that interesting and insightful. As usual, links are in the show notes. Do give Paul a follow and reach out to him. And as always, feel free to drop us a note at allthingsrisk@gmail.com, and please do be sure to spread the word about the All Things Risk podcast. That is all for now. We will be back soon. Until then, and as always, don't forget, risk is life.